dissertation that explores the Aragonese conquest of Naples in the mid-15th century, but part of that conquest involved one, the abduction of, or the attempted abduction of Queen Joanna II of Naples, which we'll talk about briefly, and most importantly, the theft of the relic of St. Louis of Toulouse, who will be the focus of today's talk. Okay. So in the early hours of November 23rd, 1423, a Catalan fleet entered the port of Marseille under the cover of darkness. Over the next 2 days, soldiers led by King Alfonso V of Aragon plundered and burned the city as its residents fled into the countryside. Before those ships left, Alfonso's men entered a private home where the city's treasures had been hidden, among them the body of the Angevin saint, St. Louis of Toulouse. Louis's relics were carried off to Valencia Cathedral, which you are looking at right now, where Alfonso turned the Angevin saint into a symbol of Aragonese control of the Kingdom of Naples and broader Italy. So this was not an isolated incident, but the latest in a series of events of abductions, thefts, and imprisonments of royal figures in Majorca, Sicily, and Naples, as the hands of the kings of Aragon, particularly Alfonso V and Peter IV, earlier in the 14th century. And Alfonso stole these relics only after his attempt to kidnap Joanna II had failed. Louis was, in other words, the second royal body that Alfonso sought to steal. His seizure of Louis's bones highlights the importance of the theft and the abduction of royal bodies in the Crown of Aragon's attempts to build a maritime empire in the Mediterranean. So Alfonso invaded Marseille after 2 years spent in Naples in active conflict with Queen Joanna II. Joanna II was without an heir in 1421 and officially adopted Alfonso V to oust her cousin Louis II from power after he tried to force her from her throne as well. Alfonso was a bit of an odd choice due to a long history of disputes between the Aragonese and the Angevin dynasty over control of Naples, as well as the regions that surround it and Sicily itself. So this decision ultimately was a mistake and did not work for Joanna's favor, as by 1422 and early 1423, Alfonso had laid siege to the city of Naples and attempted over the course of that year to capture her. Over the span of several months, Alfonso made failed attempts to capture Joanna, ultimately with the intention of imprisoning her, and with violence, either sexual violence or by murder, would have taken her throne. So his intention was to kind of hold on to her, and then either by getting rid of her, which there were precedent for that, to take over the Kingdom of Naples. So Aragonese attempts to capture Sicilian and Neapolitan queens was not without precedent, as by 1423, Joanna was the fourth in a string of captures against Joanna I in 1382, Maria of Sicily in 1379, and Blanca of Navarre in 1412. These women were either jailed or assassinated at the hands of the kings of Aragon, or in Joanna I's case, members of her own dynasty. So each of these three queens were the targets of attempts to take their thrones and allow their captors to decide their fate, either in terms of marriages, succession, or by death in Joanna I's case. So Joanna II knows this, and to prevent herself from becoming another deposed captive queen, Joanna sealed herself inside Castle Capuano, inside the city walls of Naples, until she was able to escape by late 1423 to the nearby city of Aversa, where she officially revoked her adoption of Alfonso V. Her fear of becoming the next prisoner of Alfonso V emphasizes the degree to which royal women, particularly in the Italian South, were vulnerable to abduction, dethronement, and in some instances, sexual violence. So after these attempts had failed and Joanna had successfully fled the city of Naples, Alfonso left the city in a huff. He was not happy of these developments. His decision to sail to Marseille and burn the city is the backdrop against which today's talk lies. Marseille was in Joanna's possession as an Angevin territory, since the Angevins controlled Naples and Provence. So doing this wasn't random. So his decision to sail to Marseille and burn the city is the backdrop against today's talk and the circulation of the stolen relics of Louis of Toulouse and its broader dissemination into the Spanish orbit. This case study is a piece of a larger project focused on the Crown of Aragon's expansion into Italy. I argue that the Aragonese used strategic kidnapping of royal rivals as an engine of empire. Monarchs such as Peter IV, who reigned from 1336 to 1387, and Alfonso V, who reigns from 1416 to 1458, expanded their authority beyond Barcelona in part by asserting physical control over the bodies of rulers of Naples, Sicily, and Majorca. In doing so, they laid claim to territory conceptually embodied by their captives. While medieval political theory posited that the body of the monarch was sacrosanct, yet Aragonese kings, often on the precedent of familial association, claimed physical possession of monarchs across the Western Mediterranean. Both Peter and Alfonso sought to use royal abduction to curtail and profit from the reproductive potential of their captives with the illusion of their territory that they ruled. Through these case studies, I interrogate late medieval conceptions of monarchy to expose an unrecognized dynamic of Aragonese political strategy, which tied conquest to the manipulation of human beings. So today's talk on this process and its ramifications for the movement nobility of Louis' relics between Marseille, Naples, Valencia, Malaga, and by 1600, the Spanish Empire in the Philippines. So as a dead body and one connected to the Neapolitan royal house of Anjou, Louis' relics and Aragonese empire building offer a unique perspective into the ways in which the control of bodies shaped the origins of the Crown of Aragon as a maritime empire. So to start, we have to talk about who Louis is himself and his life. So Louis of Toulouse was born in 1274 to Marie of Hungary and Charles II of Naples, who at the time was not yet king. Louis's family, the Neapolitan House of Anjou, had only controlled the Kingdom of Sicily, a territory that spanned from modern Campania to modern Sicily, for 20 years following its conquest by Charles I of Anjou. Due to their tenuous grip on their new kingdom, the Angevins had a tough time maintaining control and enforcing their rule amongst the natives of Sicily. Part of maintaining that control for the Angevin dynasty was rooted in beata strips, which is a Latin phrase that connects sanctity to members of a royal family. For the Angevins, there were three main saints who did this: Louis IX of France, Louis of Toulouse, and Mary Magdalene. In Louis of Toulouse's case, his holiness originated with his own captivity during the War of the Sicilian Vespers, which took place between 1282 and 1302, and it was a conflict that put the Angevin dynasty against the invading Crown of Aragon for control of this whole region. During this conflict, Louis's father, Charles II of Naples, was captured in 1285 off the Bay of Naples and brought to Catalonia, where he spent 3 years as a prisoner of the King of Aragon. Charles was ultimately freed in 1288, but with a major catch. His three sons, of one of which was Louis, Robert of Anjou, and Charles Martel, were to take his place as prisoners in Catalonia until 1295, when they were ultimately released. So this period of imprisonment, of which the three brothers spent their time living amongst the Franciscans, dramatically changed Louis's life and led him to renounce his claim to the throne of Naples as his father's heir and enter the Franciscan order upon his release. Louis lived only as a Franciscan bishop and Bishop of Toulouse for 2 years until his death at the age of 23 in 1297. The control of his relics immediately became an important piece of his growing cult until his canonization by John the 22nd in 1315. Between 1297 and his translation of Louis's brain to Angevin, Naples in 1319, Louis was held inside a tomb that sat behind the altar at the Franciscan monastery in the city of Marseille. Following his canonization, Robert of Naples, his brother, and his sister-in-law, Sanxia of Majorca, traveled to Marseille to visit the relic and bring Louis's brain and eventually his skull back to Naples to consecrate it in a new reliquary inside the church of Santa Chiara. Ahead of their arrival, of the Neapolitan royal couple, Robert wrote to the Viscount of Marseille to inform that they would be joined by Pope John the 22nd, Philip V of France, James II of Aragon, and Sancho I of Majorca. The congregation of the French, Neapolitan, Angevin, Aragonese, and Majorcan royal houses was dedicated to kick off a lavish celebration of the translation of his relics, which, as was the case when many relics across medieval Europe was translated, there was usually always a mass or some kind of party that was involved. So to commemorate this event, Robert instructed the Viscount of Marseille to adorn the streets with lamps that should be kept at night and lit throughout the city in honor and reverence of the saint. This ceremony and the Brain's official movement to Naples commemorated Louis both as a family saint for the Angevin dynasty, in a similar sense to other saints that I mentioned, and as a symbol of the Angevin rule in both Provence and Naples itself. Between 1319 and the end of Robert of Anjou's reign in Naples in 1343, he continued to celebrate his brother's cult and link it closer to the House of Anjou. Given the end of the War of the Sicilian Vespers in 1302, granted the Angevin dynasty control of the peninsular regions of the Kingdom of Naples, which includes modern Campania, Abruzzo, Molise, Puglia, Calabria, and Basilicata, and the Crown of Aragon got control just only of the island of Sicily. The two dynasties worked to strengthen their own claims of southern Italy, as both worked in competition with one another. Between 1302 and the 15th century, both dynasties claimed that they were the true rulers of southern Italy, so there was many conflicts between the two and outright warfare over control of the island of Sicily as well as the peninsular regions. For the Angevins, and as we'll see today broadly with the Spanish Empire and the Aragonese, this meant a connection with saints and a legitimacy that they could provide. During the 1330s, Queen Sansia of Majorca had a reliquary, which you can see on your screen, made to protect and house the arm of St. Louis of Toulouse, to move more pieces of his body from Marseille to the Church of Santa Chiara. This arm reliquary, now housed at the Louvre, is the first of an important reliquary in our story today, due to its decoration and possession by the Crown of Aragon after Sansia's death. The emblem of the Angevin royal house appears at the base of the reliquary, which, if you could see my mouse, is right here at the top. And at the wrist, along with the phrase, "This is the arm of St. Louis the Bishop." The phrasing and the emblems were added to the reliquary sometime between 1336 and 1338, when Sansia commissioned Neapolitan artists to adorn it with gold, red, and blue. Sarah Kololowski has argued that the decoration and adoration of Louis' relics in Naples between 1319 and 1338 can be linked to the creation of the St. Louis altarpiece by Simone Martini in 1317. The connection between these reliquaries, this altarpiece, and the authority of the Angevins of Naples emphasizes the importance of the saint in the legend of the dynasty and its broader position in southern Italy. Go back. So to embolden the reliquary, and hence Louis' arm, with the crest of the royal house and Sansia herself, the relic cannot be separated from the House of Anjou. Now here's that picture. So in most instances, reliquaries that did adorn royal crests, as you can see here with the reliquary bust of San Gennaro in the Cathedral of Naples, were always done for political purposes, to quite literally brand the body of the saint with the image of the ruler, which in his case you could see is done like on the chest of the decoration. So following Sansia's death in 1335, the relic's arrival in Iberia and into the hands of the House of Barcelona, and eventually the House of Trastamara, which is Alfonso V's dynasty, led the adoption of the reliquary into an Iberian object. For most of the object's time in Iberia, it remained inside the Dominican convent of Santa Maria de Real and Medina del Campo, under the direct care of the Trastamara dynasty. In the hands of the Castilian branch of the dynasty, Louis' arm shifted from an Angevin object decorated by Sansia to one that bore the emblems of the House of Trastamara, both ruling in the crown of Aragon by 1412, and in Castile, which you could see is right here at the bottom. Art historians such as Diana Norman have suggested that this reliquary was given as a gift by Sansia to her cousin Eleanor of Aragon sometime in the 1340s. Since both women were not actually alive at the same time, this explanation doesn't really make very much sense, since the reliquary was both crafted as a moment of hostility between the dynasties, and the matter that Sansia was dead in 1345 when Eleanor was born by 1358. So this reliquary's association with Aragon and Castile, however, ties Louis of Toulouse closer to the House of Trastamara and the events that we talked about earlier in November of 1423 in the port of Marseille. Alfonso of Aragon's theft of Louis's body effectively took control of Louis and his relics away from the House of Anjou and brought them to the House of Trastamara, bringing the armed reliquary and the rest of the body into Iberian control. Aragonese chroniclers that describe this event and the arrival of the saint into Catalan hands in the fleet in Marseille speak to the idea of Alfonso's abductions of the relics as him saving them from Angevin control. In Bartolomeo Baccio's La Conquista de Naples, Alfonso's hunt for Louis' relics is described as a quest to find the body and the true saint after Alfonso believes that two Catalan men may have hidden it. So I'm just going to read a brief part that you have on your screen. So, however, Alfonso, eager to find the saint, did not let his mind rest, for he believed what had really happened, that the body had been hidden from fear that the discoveries would be forced to return the gold to the tomb. Therefore, when he learned that the henchmen of the gallery in which they were traveling had been with them, he ordered this man to be brought immediately into the presence and question him about what had happened to the body. So for Baccio, who wrote this text, and other Aragonese historians that were active in the court of Alfonso of Naples after 1442, when he officially conquers the city, Alfonso's quest to find the body and bring it home to Valencia is a noble one that ultimately leads to his conquest of Naples and the celebration of Louis in both Iberian and Italian lands. So the next phase of this talk will focus more on Aragonese Spanish use of Louis of Toulouse and how by his arrival in the Philippines in the late 16th century, Louis had become a truly Iberian saint. So Louis's body, pictured here from modern Valencia Cathedral, arrived at the Royal Palace of Valencia in 1424, just over a month after his abduction from Marseille. Between 1424 and 1437, when his bones were officially interred at the Valencia Cathedral, or rather, the Royal Palace of Valencia, Louis's place in the city was dubious since the current Pope, Martin V, and the King of France, Charles VII, were outraged at the abduction of these relics. Louis, as a member of the House of Anjou, was a saint of the French royal line and connected to the Beatistrips of the House of Capet. The movement of this relic to Valencia effectively took his control of the remains and the cult of both the French and Neapolitan saint and made him an Aragonese one. So for Charles VII, a king who had his own problems with the kings of Aragon, he did not appreciate that Alfonso was effectively expanding his rule into Italy and further into the Mediterranean. This theft was a direct insult to his rule, his family, and the rooting of the French in the Mediterranean. For Martin V, this abduction and the burning of Marseille was a signal of growing Aragonese aggression and dominance in the Mediterranean and Angevin territories of Provence and Naples, as well as it's an insult by the 15th century to take a relic and steal it, as this was a much wider practiced process earlier in the Middle Ages, really before the year 1000. So the arrival of the relics to Valencia is described in multiple documents now housed at the archive of the Cathedral of Valencia. The first entrusts that Louis and his bones will officially be granted to the guardianship and the care of Valencia and its clergy, among them Alfonso Borgia. So the precious relics of the heart of Saint Louis and the other saints and other jewels, and things described, have been discovered or delivered by the very high lord, King Alfonso of Aragon, to the honorable lords of the chapter of the cathedral and the jurors of the city of Valencia. While this letter asked that Louis and other Neapolitan relics, which there were many, remain in their care, Alfonso's cache of relics was not officially brought and donated to the cathedral until 1437. In 1425, however, his relics were moved into the St. Catherine Chapel of the Royal Palace, among the other relics of the king. Louis's relic is one of many that Alfonso V and some of his predecessors were working on building. So between 1424 and 1437, Alfonso continued to collect relics for the cathedral and move relics from the Royal Chapel of St. Agatha in Barcelona to Valencia. As Michael Ryan has shown in his study of relics in the late 14th century, two of Alfonso's predecessors, John the Hunter, who reigned from 1387 to 1396, and Martin the Elder, who reigned from 1396 to 1410, stored royal relics in Barcelona and turned the Chapel of St. Agatha into a depository for royal relics. So until the movement of these objects to Valencia, the chapel served as the primary space, besides the royal monastery of Poblet outside of Tarragona, and the royal monastery of San Juan de la Pena for relics associated with the House of Barcelona. The decision to move these objects from Catalonia to Valencia stemmed from Alfonso's existing disputes with the Catalan nobility and the local government in Barcelona. Due in part to Alfonso's favoring of his Trastamara relatives in Castile and his constant wars in Italy, the Catalan nobility grew frustrated with their lack of attention by the king. As both a king of Aragon and a count of Barcelona, as for all Aragonese kings, the weakening of Barcelona as the chief city in Aragonese territory made the king untrustworthy in the eyes of the Catalan nobility. The mistrust of Alfonso and the worsening relationship between him and the Catalan nobles set the stage for Valencia, becoming both a new site of royal relics and the home of St. Louis of Toulouse. For Alfonso, then, holding Louis's relics in his possession was about holding a physical piece of the Angevin dynasty and their claims to Naples. In 1437, Alfonso had a family tree made that is now housed at the library of the University of Valencia that displays Alfonso's connections to Naples that tie him through the Angevin claim and their predecessors in the Norman and Hohenstaufen periods. Claiming Naples for him was less about conquest and more about the family and bloodline that brought the House of Barcelona and House of Trastamara into Naples. Because if we pause for a moment and look at this image, you'll see at the top, right here where my mouth is, that is meant to be Roger II of Sicily, the first Sicilian king, with Alfonso holding quite literally a tie to him right down here at the bottom of the image. So 40 years following Alfonso's successful conquest of Naples in 1442 and his rule in the city until his death in 1458, Louis of Toulouse's cult continued to grow in Valencia. In the 1480s and 1490s, Abigail Agresta has shown that Louis was among a cult of saints in the city whose relics were used in response to epidemics such as the plague and environmental disasters such as floods, earthquakes, and other harsh weather. Without going too far into detail for the sake of time, it is important to note that Louis's influence in Valencia did not end in the 1490s. As Louis became a central figure in Valencian religious art well into the 18th century, which by then, Louis was both a Spanish saint and a Valencian one. If you look at these images right here, the one on the left, the one on the right, you can see Louis is meant to be this bishop right here, crowning the King of Spain. But later in the 15th century, however, in a different Spanish city, Louis of Toulouse and his relics became a major piece of the fabric of Malaga. Louis and his relics were used again as a tool of conquest against the Nasrid rulers of Malaga. in the last years of the so-called Reconquista or Reconquest. Considering many of the accounts of the sieges of both cities are rife with anti-Islamic racism, violence, and apocalyptic messaging, the association between the fall of Malaga, as well as the fall of Granada, and St. Louis of Toulouse sticks out in the sources. In one of the first official descriptions of the conquest of the city by its first bishop in 1492, Pedro Diaz of Toledo, writes, so I'm not going to read this whole thing, I'm going to read part of it. A very solemn feast be perpetually celebrated in the city of Malaga throughout the bishopric on the day of St. Louis, bishop, son of the king of Sicily, that is to be observed throughout the city of Malaga and the borders of the sea to it, as the holy day of Sunday from the first vespers until the entire day of St. Louis, which is celebrated on the 19th of August, which is coincidentally the same day that Malaga was conquered. So Diaz's association between the conquest of the city and of St. Louis of Toulouse is the first of many to link veneration of the city to the saint's new Christian origin. Considering Louis was not a saint known to be associated with Malaga, or really southern Spain at all, the celebration of his feast in the city for centuries after 1487 speaks to the continued association with conquest, as we saw in Valencia and with Naples. The stark difference here, as his role in the conquest of Naples, is the use of Louis as a symbol in Malaga, and its newfound both Christian and inquisitorial identity that is adopted after 1492. Recent scholarship by Max Dideroff, David Coleman, and A. Katie Harris has shown that the early modern Spanish monarchy constructed the cities of the former emirate of Granada, of which Malaga was one, into Christian environments in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. These newly Christian cities constructed new churches after models in other Spanish cities such as Valencia, Barcelona, and Madrid by its creation as a city later in the early modern period. For Louis's cult to be a prominent piece of this anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish Christianization of the city allowed for his role as a saint to take on new life. As really before his abduction in 1423, Louis was never really associated with the Iberian Peninsula beyond his own imprisonment there. Before this moment, wouldn't have made sense to use Louis as a tool for this. So, but by 1714, Malaga Cathedral used its association with the feast of St. Louis of Toulouse to request that the saint's relic be translated from Valencia to the Cathedral of Malaga. In a series of exchanges between both religious and secular leaders in Malaga and the Cathedral of Valencia, the argument is made that, quote, a relic and a bone of Mr. St. Louis, Bishop of Toulouse, whose entire body is venerated in the said Cathedral of Valencia, is to have in this city, Malaga, for having been won from the Moors on the eve of the saint, which is on 18th August in the last year of 1487. And to have him, Louis, as co-patron of the city, and to have a procession of this day. So the association here between Louis, his body, and Malaga suggests that for the people of the city, the conquest of Malaga on the feast of the Saint of Louis of Toulouse makes the event directly associated with his cult and the ongoing project of Christianizing the city. Valencia Cathedral, of course, did not want to lose the bones of the relic that at this point they had had for 300 years. So by 1720, after some disputes, Malaga was granted a small piece of Louis' bones. Not the entire thing, that still is remained in Valencia. So in the 17th century, Louis' relics were, once again, a major part of the building of a Franciscan church in Lukban in the Philippines, as Spaniards came to colonize the Pacific world. The church dedicated to Louis at Lukban now holds the relic of a very small fragment, which you can see here, of his bone. So with this context in mind, by 1730, Louis, his cult, and his relics had reached a global scale from Valencia, Malaga, and the arm that still was in Medina del Campo. This mission in the newly established and also he is also in a mission in the newly established Spanish colony at San Luis Obispo in modern California. In making Louis a truly global saint and a Spanish one, Louis transformed from a saint only associated with Naples and the Angevin dynasty into one whose relics were spread across the entire globe, into the Philippines, the Iberian Peninsula, and by 1862, back in the city of Toulouse. In 1862, the Bishop of Toulouse and the cathedral there did request from Valencia a small fragment to have a piece of their bishop returned to the city, and they were granted that. You can still go to Toulouse Cathedral and see a very tiny fragment of his body on display. So his reliquaries, many of which are now empty, have spread even farther, as his arm is now at the Louvre, a bust is at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and other objects span from the Louvre, the Cleveland Museum of Art, and Naples. Whilst much is still left to be learned about Louis, the global circulation of his body and relics, his place within the Spanish world, the movement of his relics places a saint linked with conquest, illuminates the importance of saint in the history of empire and how the abduction and possession of bodies, royal and holy, was linked to dynastic claims. Through the process of splitting the body between Spanish cities, as opposed to only Angevin ones before 1423, Louis became a truly Spanish saint that is celebrated in this tradition long after 1423. Thank you.
That was awesome. That was really wonderful. My mind is spinning. Thank you so much for being our inaugural speaker. And I guess we will move into questions, and I'll kick us off actually, because I'm full of them now after hearing this. Um, I can't help but think, as you're talking about like stealing relics, it reminds me of like rival football teams stealing mascots, right? And I always think of that. And I think you've really, really touched on the power of relics to legitimize. And I'm wondering, now that, we've talked about the peripatetic life of all of these, relics or pieces of his body, are they still being used to legitimize? And in what ways? And where you kind of talked a bit about where things are now, but obviously the legitimizing is, a little different. People aren't, conquering kingdoms necessarily, but can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, so even still in Malaga and then also in Valencia, you could still travel there and see the relics, and the relics are still used in the procession of course, like in Holy Week and other times in the Spanish liturgical calendar. The relics that are in Valencia Cathedral, Louis, the biggest and probably most important one, among others, they have a whole collection that is things from supposedly the Virgin Mary's hairbrush to like the crown of thorns, which most churches in the Middle Ages claim they have. They use these in processions in Holy Week, and it also the same as in Malaga. His Saint's Day is still celebrated, and also that church in the Philippines, he's still a major piece there. But yeah, he has really gotten pretty far afield. Like even in the Cleveland Museum of Art, that reliquary is empty now, but it is still like one of the major pieces of the medieval art collection that gets celebrated. So he's not used in the same sense in modern Valencia and Malaga, but he's still an important fabric of the city.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's almost like now his reliquary is used to legitimize art collections or, kind of prop up their prestige. That's so fascinating. Are there any other questions for Jessica? You've covered so much ground. Um, I was fascinated with the beginning of your talk when you were talking about like the use of female bodies to form empire. Are you in any way going to expand on that in your scholarship, or are you more focused on the relics themselves?
No, that is the main focus of the dissertation. So each of those cases gets their own chapter. Louis is the last chapter since he is the furthest in time, and it kind of bleeds into the early modern period. But the majority of the chapters cover the abduction of, say, like Maria, Queen of Sicily, who gets abducted in 1379 in Catania. Then there's also Blanca of Navarre, who gets covered in the dissertation, and she doesn't get successfully captured. Her case is strange. She is the regent of the island of Sicily after the death of her husband and her father-in-law during the period of the Aragonese interregnum, when there is no monarch ruling the crown of Aragon. She is left to kind of take care of Sicily and keep it an Aragonese possession. And in that moment, she is quite literally chased around the island by a Catalan nobleman who wants to use her to build a new dynasty to keep Sicily independent. So she has her own chapter. Her case is very interesting. And then this chapter covers both what happens with Joanna II, more so in the front half, and then the back half is mainly about Louis of Toulouse and kind of how this one strange case with a relic and a dead body gets used. And the only other male case that is in the dissertation is a living one. It's James IV of Majorca, who gets imprisoned in an iron cage, very unfortunately, by Peter IV of Aragon, who I mentioned in the mid 14th century. So the whole thing is basically a collection of all these royal figures who were either imprisoned against their will, their relics were stolen and used for other reasons. The whole thing is about how these bodies get stolen and used.
That's really fascinating. That is amazing. Francesca looks like she has a question.
Yeah, so again, thank you so much for such an amazing talk. It was, yeah, really interesting to hear. I think especially it makes me realize how little I know about places like Naples, where even my own family are from. But yeah, I want to hear a bit more about Joanna's case and what happened there. Because obviously, it was so interesting to hear that background of like her being besieged there. And then sort of Alfonso leaving in a huff about all of this, like you kind of mentioned that there were other cases where that had happened for even Joanna's predecessors. Are there any cases that stand out to you as particularly poignant or interesting to your research that, obviously I appreciate so much was covered in this talk, but there's always, so much more to people's research. Is there anything else that you didn't fit in that you thought was really kind of intriguing about some of these other cases that you mentioned there?
Thank you. Yeah, Joanna II is a very interesting case. I didn't spend too much time going into it. She could be really her own subject for a talk. She's interesting in her decision to adopt Alfonso V as her heir is strange because the Aragonese and the Angevins at this point had been at each other's throats over control of Sicily for at this point over a century. So for her to name an Aragonese king as her heir and really trust him that he wouldn't do something to make that happen sooner is a bit odd, and it obviously does not work for her. But she spends the time between when he arrives in Naples in 1421 and his when he leaves in 1423. She learns slowly that he is really not to be trusted. So once he starts physically trying to come after her, she is an ally who is a member of the Sforza family from Milan, who tries to prevent Alfonso from taking control of her so she can escape and then take back what she did. She eventually does make her cousin Louis II her heir, who she was trying to oust to begin with, but he dies shortly afterwards, and then his son Louis III is adopted as her heir. Unfortunately for her, neither of them succeed her, but by the time she dies in 1435, both men have died. And the only person left in the Angevin dynasty is Rene of Anjou, who becomes king, and then eventually is the one Alfonso takes the throne from. But I did mention Joanna the First, who is not really in the project in the sense where she doesn't really get a chapter dedicated to her, but she does come up quite a bit. Her reign was quite odd, and is one that is kind of there was some discussion about it during her lifetime because she was accused of murdering her first husband. There was uproar when she chose the Angevin Pope over the Roman Pope, which we didn't really get into the Western Schism here, but that is also in the backdrop of a lot of this. So once she makes that decision to really with the papacy, she is imprisoned by her cousin, Charles III, who is also the king of Hungary at the time, and he decides he no longer wants a female ruler to be on the throne in Naples. So he imprisons her in Castle Uovo, which is on the Bay of Naples in Naples now. You can go see it. And that's where she is. We believe that she was murdered because she ends up dead. There's no official count that she was murdered. I mean, there's chroniclers that make that argument, but we don't know for certain. And when she has died, Naples really is in a lot of chaos between these dynastic rulers, Charles III, his son Ladislaus, and then his daughter Joanna II. So by the time she comes on and she makes Alfonso her heir, things are already very topsy-turvy in Naples at the time. But while her case is important, it's one that's kind of in the background of this project too.
Yeah, there's so much to this. It's hard to pick a question. Does anybody else have a question for our speaker? I guess I will end with a question. Where do you go from here? Are you going to expand upon this research into something else? Are you taking a whole different turn? Where do you go from here?
Yeah, so I have to finish the dissertation, of course, that this is a part of. So after that, it'll eventually be turned into a book. But for now, I do want to include, well, at least in the book phase, my intention is to include some discussion of Sardinia, because I haven't done that just yet in the dissertation, because Sardinia also has a ruling family. They are ruled by judges and they're not ruled by monarchs who gets abducted and imprisoned by the King of Aragon. Hers is it's ruled by a female judge, Eleanor of Iberia, who similarly goes through this process. So she, I think, will be saved for the book version of this. So there are too many cases of this happening versus not enough. This is something that is a process that not even just in the Aragonese world, you see it also queens get imprisoned. Eleanor of Aquitaine being the famous example. This is something that's happening across medieval Europe, but it's really the Aragonese who take control of it and use it to build an empire in the Mediterranean. So a book project eventually, but I have to finish graduate school first.
Yes, definitely get that dissertation written because I'm looking forward to a book. I think it would make a great miniseries too, frankly, but all the kidnapping and drama. Um, okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for being our inaugural speaker. I would just like to remind everyone that this is a monthly series and that next month we have Laura Gathigan, who actually is present with us today. And she'll be talking about her book, Queen Matilda of Flanders, and just how she embodied her queenship and the book is organized by body and it's just fantastic. It's going to be amazing. So we hope to see you there. We hope to see you at our colloquium. Wow. Next Saturday, just to come and chat. Again, thank you very much, and we will see you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Oops. All right.